Today I made the drive up to Healdsburg, California to be one of the very first people to get their hands on the new 2022 EV6. This is not Kia's first EV, but it is by far their most important EV so far. This has the range that most folks are after, over 300 miles of range depending on the version that you get, and the performance that a lot of EV shoppers seem to crave. Up to 576 horsepower is going to be available if you're patient in the EV6. Right now, a little over 300 horsepower is where this model tops out, and that's the one I'm driving today. The first thing to know about the new EV6 is that this is the close relative of the Hyundai Ioniq 5 and the upcoming Genesis full EV as well. But this is not simply an Ioniq 5 with a different nose job. The structure of the EV6 is fairly different, and you'll notice this is definitely more aggressively styled and more swoopy because the EV6 is targeted at someone that's after more of a performance-oriented EV. As you approach the EV6, the first thing you're going to notice is this much more angular and more expressive design than we've seen in any of Kia's EVs before. We have full LED reflector headlights here, very distinctive LED accents there. The radar sensor is right in the middle of the bottom, and then it has sort of a double karate chop here with the front end ducking down right there just after the Kia logo and the hood, and then again right there under this crash portion of the bumper. Be sure and let me know what you think about the styling of the EV6 down there in the comment section. This angle really shows off the short and really low-slung hood. This particular profile is one of the reasons that the EV6 does not have a terribly large storage area under the front, even though this was designed from the ground up to be an electric vehicle. This hood is considerably shorter than the hood that we find in a Tesla Model Y or a Ford Mustang Mach E, for instance, and it really is lower to the ground up front as well, leaving us less room under the hood for some of those systems, but more room for things like the optional heat pump or a tiny amount of storage under there. From this angle, you'll also notice the big 20-inch wheels and wide 255 width tires. If you get the top-end version of the EV6, 255s happen all the way around. Those are wider than the Mustang Mach E GT, even with the performance pack, and considerably wider than the base tires you'll find on, for instance, the Mustang Mach E that we have here at Alex & Autos as a long-term loaner. At 184.3 inches, this is a little bit shorter than the Mustang Mach E and about 2 inches longer than the Ioniq 5, on which it's closely related. But the big difference between this and the Ioniq 5 is actually the wheelbase. These wheels are about 4 inches closer together, 114.2 inches on this and over 118 inches in the Ioniq 5. The Ioniq 5's wheelbase is actually longer than a Kia Telluride. Now, oddly enough, even though the wheelbase is a little bit shorter, this has a tiny bit more room inside in terms of legroom than we find in the Ioniq. Although I wouldn't call the EV6 a style-first crossover, this is certainly a style-forward crossover, and there were certainly some considerations and some things given up in order to give this the swoopy look that it has. You'll really notice this severe haunchback here in the rear that gives it a powerful look, but it obviously cuts down on interior practicality. Cargo room in here is a little bit below the Mach E or the Ioniq 5, and the shoulder width area in the back also gets pinched a little bit as a result of this design. But I think this looks really, really good. We have a spoiler up top, a duckbill spoiler, I suppose you call it, right there on the rear hatch. It integrates with the taillights. Kia hides away the charger behind this door right here, sort of integrated in this tail lamp area. And this particular color is an almost matte gray. Moving fully around to the rear, the wide stance is further accentuated by this LED bar that goes from one side to the other, really making it look even wider than it already is. Also helping out the 255 with tires that don't look crazy narrow. You can see that that charge door decided to close itself because I wasn't doing anything with it. This is the GT line trim, so we have well integrated parking sensors down here, and this is a lift back or sportback, whatever you want to call this design. It's not really a hatchback because it honestly is more horizontal than it is vertical. When the EV6 first goes on sale in the US, it's going to be available with 2 different battery packs and 3 different power levels. Later on, there's going to be the GT version with 576 horsepower if you want to go 0 to 60 in 3.5 seconds. Let's talk about the base model first. That's going to be a single motor version with the smaller 58 kilowatt hour battery pack. They're calling that trim the light trim, and it will get you 232 miles of range. 167 horsepower isn't terribly powerful, but the reason for that model in the EV6 lineup is simply to act as a replacement for other inexpensive EVs that up till this point Kia has been selling here. Next up, we have the models that you're probably really interested in, the Wind and the GT line. Again, this one is a GT line. That will get you either 225 horsepower and 258 pound-feet of torque if you choose the single motor version, and that single motor is in the rear of the vehicle where it belongs. Same battery pack on both the dual motor and the single motor version, 77.4 kilowatt hours. This model adds a front electric motor to bring you up to 320 horsepower and 446 pound-feet of torque. Logically, due to the swoopier and more aerodynamic design of the EV6, EPA range is longer than the closely related Ioniq 5. This gets 310 miles if you choose the big battery and rear-wheel drive, 274 if you choose all-wheel drive and the big battery pack. That is actually a little bit further than the Mustang Mach E that we have as a long-term loaner here at Alex & Autos. Now for 2022, Ford has bumped up the range a little bit to 277, but keep in mind that battery pack is significantly bigger than this battery pack. This is 77.4 kilowatt hours. The usable capacity of the Mustang Mach E's battery pack is right around 90 kilowatt hours, so it is a significantly bigger battery, and that means added weight. Then you combine that with the fact that the Mach E has skinnier tires, and you know where I'm going in the drive section. Now let's take a look actually under the hood here. As you can see, there is a tiny little storage compartment. I have removed this section so you can see what's under there. We basically have some inverters and DC-DC converters right under there, and then further down the electric motor and the front steering rack. The front axle is right about here in the vehicle, keep that in mind. There's also a 12-volt battery pack over there on the driver's side. Now, some folks have complained that this is inefficient packaging, but I would remind you of a few things. First, this has a heat pump, which takes a little bit more room under the hood. And remember that there has to be enough room for a crush zone. So sure, Kia could have smashed everything somewhere and given us some sort of cargo compartment, but then you wouldn't have a crumple zone, and that wouldn't be good for crash standards. Again, charging happens back here behind door number 1. There's an onboard 11 kilowatt AC charger, which is pretty average for a mainstream EV these days. DC fast charge speeds will depend on which battery pack you choose. If you choose the smaller pack, Kia says that the peak charge rate is 180 kW. If you choose the bigger battery pack, which is what this model has, it gets a 240 kilowatt DC fast charge rating, basically the same as the Ioniq 5. Because the two battery packs charge at different rates, both battery packs have the same DC fast charge top-up rating of 18 minutes according to Kia, and based on my experience in the Ioniq 5, it is absolutely believable if you have access to a 350 kilowatt DC fast charge station. Those are more common for interstate travel, less common inside the city. The fast charge rates are thanks to the 800-volt battery design in the EV6, very similar to what we see in the Porsche Taycan, and pretty different from what we see in the ID.4 or the Mach E, which are based on 400-volt packs. If you want to get this kind of charge speeds, it looks like 800 volts is the way to go, although Tesla does have a peak charge rate in many of their products pretty equal to what we see in the EV6 and the Ioniq 5. If you want to explore a deep dive into charging this battery pack, I have a deep dive video on that in an Ioniq 5. The charge rates of this battery pack are absolutely astounding, and it's essentially the same battery in the Kia. The EV6 and its platform mates are going to be one of the first vehicles to support vehicle-to-load functionality, and this is what the vehicle-to-load connector by Kia looks like. This section right here closes off, so that way it can help prevent water from getting in there too much. Pops open, if I can do that again, and we have a 15 amp 120 volt connector right in there. We simply plug it into the vehicle right there by that charge connector, hit the power button on the back, it turns on, locks the plug in, and then the little light will tell you that vehicle to load functionality is ready. You can then draw power right there through the connector. That's part of why we have this level gauge right back here, because at a glance, without getting in the vehicle, you can see how much power you've got left in the car. This is not obviously enough to power your entire home in the event of a power outage like you can get out of a Ford F-150 Lightning or a Ford F-150 Hybrid, but it's certainly enough to power your average campsite. Over a day of mixed driving, I found the front seats to be fairly comfortable. This is a multi-way power adjustable driver's seat. The seat bottom cushion adjusts for tilt, something that is missing on my Mach E Premium. And we have a two-way adjustable lumbar support, which has a reasonable range of motion. I would love to see a four-way though. We have a tilt telescopic steering column. It's manual with a decent range of motion. And as you'll see in a bit, the steering wheel has a somewhat unusual shape to it, but it does have a flat bottom, making it easier to get in and out of the vehicle. Jumping into the back, we find tons of legroom, over 81 inches of combined legroom. This, oddly enough, has exactly the same amount of legroom that we find in the Mach E, but keep in mind that Ford does measure their legroom a little bit differently than some companies, so this actually feels a little roomier than that Mach E. There's a reasonable amount of width back here, and we have a completely flat load floor, but because of the sexy profile that I mentioned earlier, keep in mind that shoulder room is going to be a little bit narrower. So this is not the kind of EV where you could fit 3 larger forward-facing child seats back here easily. We have USB charge ports integrated into the front seat backs. That's kind of a cool touch. But no air vents in the center console, they're over here on the outboard side, so nothing for that center passenger. When it comes to cargo volume, it's best not to think of the EV6 as a RAV4 or a CRV replacement. This has a considerably smaller cargo area at 24.4 cubic feet. This is approximately the same size cargo area as we find in a Kia Stinger. And that sort of makes sense, because even though this is not a direct replacement for the Stinger is living on at least for a while in America, this is logically the Stinger's spiritual successor. But the cargo area is quite a bit smaller than the Mach E or the ID4. The ID4 gives you 30.3 cubic feet, the Mach E just under 30 cubic feet plus about 5 cubic feet in the front trunk. As we look around the interior, keep in mind that I am in a GT line trim. We have a power sunroof and a power sunroof shade, which is interesting given that the sunroof is a very standard size sunroof. We have sliding sun visors for the driver and front passenger, height adjustable shoulder belts, and two-way adjustable headrests. From this angle, you can really see the somewhat unusual and I guess I would say eccentric shape of these front seat backs. It's a very high seat back there, and then the headrest sort of goes into that slot. These seats are a combination of imitation leather and imitation suede upholstery. They're both heated and ventilated. Ventilated seats are something that we don't find for any price on the Mach E for some reason. Moving over to the front doors, the entire upper section of the front doors is made from soft touch materials, those two upper sections there. We do find hard plastics lower on the door. This model has the optional Meridian sound system, the same brand of sound system that we find on many Jaguar and Land Rover products. In keeping with the modern exterior, the interior is quite modern as well. You can see this really modern fabric on the dashboard. That's the best way to describe this. It's sort of an imitation leather, I guess you'd say, molded onto a hard plastic. So it's not squishy like a slush molded dashboard, but it definitely has a texture to it and a premium look and feel. There are also blue accent stripes all along that section of the dash there. We have a large bin and slot style glove compartment. Lots of storage area going on there. Two big air vents here. Big array of LCDs right here on the dashboard. These are approximately 12-inch LCDs, one for the infotainment and navigation system, running the latest version of Kia's software. Now, because this is running the latest version of Kia's software, it does not yet support wireless Apple CarPlay. It has to use a USB cable. Over here, we have essentially the same sort of instrument cluster software that we find in the Ioniq 5, but with a bit of a Kia twist. Down here on the steering wheel, we have the drive mode selector that cycles through the various looks that we see there in that instrument cluster. You can also select them without the drive mode if you'd rather. Going back to the center console here for a moment, we have some touch buttons for the climate control system and for the infotainment system. So we hit this button to swap between those, and you can see that the display changes. This is actually a small LCD right in there, and then there are touch controls with physical knobs. Those knobs change function as well. I have to say these buttons have a really good feel to them. It feels a little bit better than the average capacitive touch button. Below that, we have two USB ports. You can see those are sort of in that large footwell right there. The floor is pretty flat up front. We just have that bump there, and then you can see that there is a little bit of section right there where you could roll an item, I guess, from the driver's footwell to the passenger footwell. We then have 12-volt power ports right there, a USB charge-only port, a big storage cubby right there between the front seats. You could easily put something like a large purse or other items there. Then we have this really accentuated floating console that hangs out right there on top of all of that. We have buttons for the heated and ventilated seats, heated steering wheel right there. That's the start-stop button for the car. We have a rotary shifter, 360-degree camera activation button, auto brake hold. There's a button to enable and disable the parking sensors, two big cup holders, a Qi wireless charging mat that does seem to handle thicker cases, which is a nice touch, although this iPhone Max just barely fits right there in that area. This is a flip-up center console. Decent amount of storage space there, but nothing too spectacular. A little bit less under that armrest than we find in the Mach E. This has the same sort of fabric and texture going on the dashboard, but with more of a squish to it. Now let's take a closer look at the infotainment software. As you can see, this supports widescreen smartphone integration if your phone supports that. EV-specific screens are over here under EV. A nice touch here is that it will show you your range if you were to turn off the air conditioning there. You can also adjust your vehicle to load settings here. This is the point at which vehicle to load will turn off in order to help reserve battery for some future use. If I click on this settings option here, you can choose the maximum charge on AC or DC charging, so it will stop there. You can also adjust your AC charging current if required, winter mode there, and utility mode. You can turn those on and off. Because this is an EV without an engine under the hood, Kia has given us the opportunity to make changes to the way the sound design system works. You can turn off the augmented sound, make it basically high, medium, and low, and you can change the sound as well. Rather unfortunately, I don't have a good way to demonstrate these sounds, stylish, dynamic, or cyber. My personal preference is for dynamic as far as the sound design system goes. Now let's check out the factory navigation routing. I'm going to get directions here to Los Angeles. Hey, how about the Los Angeles International Airport? That is quite far away. So you can see it's 420 miles. Obviously, there's going to be some DC fast charging required. Let's see what this does. I should say at this point, it may take a little while to do this routing because I have almost no signal. There we go, it finally did it here. Insufficient charge, so we'll say visit charging stations along the route, say okay. And you will notice that it did not actually recommend any specific charge points. I can add them. I can say add a waypoint here, and I can add a DC charge station, POI category, for instance, EV charging stations, etc. But it doesn't automatically add them in the same way that the Mach E or the Tesla Model Y, Model 3, etc. would. I can hit the search stations option, if that's what you're wondering about here, and it will say stations along the route near current position, near destination. Those are a little bit difficult to see right there because it's still, again, thinking about it. Over here you can see the signal. It's had just about 1 bar of 3G most of the time that I'm out here. So the signal in this part of California is very, very poor. Definitely keep that in mind. As you can see, it has charging spots here along the corridor. So, you can see that we have EV charging stations there, etc. But it is not showing much information about those charging stops. The Electrify America logo, however, will tell you that that is a higher power station. I can go ahead and click on, say, this particular option here, and I can add a waypoint, but I have to do this myself. EV6 and its relative, the Ioniq 5, will charge very rapidly. It's not going to automatically suggest those charging stops like some of the competition. Back on the driver's side, the big hole in the dashboard is for the full color heads-up display that we have in this model, another thing that we don't find in the Mach E. Over here we have a very eccentrically shaped steering wheel. I'll zoom out a little bit so you can see this. It has a flat bottom, and this center portion of the wheel is definitely closer to that bottom than it is to the top. We have some aggressive sport grips there. Paddles on the back. These are not paddle shifters, these are regen braking paddles. You can see this little display here. That's how you know what the regen level is set to. Right now the regeneration level is set to max. I can use the paddle on the right side of the steering wheel to decrease the amount of regeneration or go to an auto mode where the car will automatically adjust the regeneration for me. It has 3 different levels of regeneration and then the auto mode, which itself is slightly configurable. On the left side of the steering wheel, we have the buttons for the radar adaptive cruise control, a button for the trip computer and multi-information cluster right there, and then buttons for the infotainment system over here on the right. Now it's time to talk about how the EV6 drives. For that, I have a red all-wheel drive model, 320 horsepower, and a gray rear-wheel drive model, and I also have my good friend Sophie here from Redline Reviews. Sophie, how can they find you?
Oh, you can find me on Instagram at redline_reviews. We also have a TikTok that we just started, and of course, YouTube. You can just go to Redline Reviews.
Redline Reviews. So let's get these out on the road. So we're now out on the road in the rear-wheel drive model. First, I'm really impressed with the fact that Kia decided to make this rear-wheel drive by default, even if you get the really slow one.
Yeah, you know what? It has plenty of power. I mean, 225 horsepower. This is like comparable to like a Volkswagen GTI.
And it feels pretty good. It feels really well balanced, even with just the one motor, because of course the battery's in the middle, so it, did they say weight balance? I think it's 50-50.
I believe with these EVs, it's, 50-50, but they don't always say. They just say it's got that skateboard platform and the really low center of gravity. But I genuinely think that this is like one of the sportiest driving EVs that is on the market right now.
It is. I love it.
Well, I've always thought it was like Tesla, but like now, like with this, I think that Kia has definitely raised the bar. And I love how it's firmer and more sporty versus the Ioniq 5.
But it's still not firm and it's like not unlivable. It's a really good balance, I think.
Right, and this one here that we're driving has the 19-inch wheels and 20mm skinnier tires. I'm not a fan of these Kumo tires on it. What do you think of it?
No, I'm not a fan of the tires necessarily exactly, but I love the fact that they're wide from the factory. So 235s on this, 255s on the all-wheel drive one that you were spending most of your time in. So you could put 255 summer tires on it yourself super easy.
Yeah, and I think that the ride quality is also really good. I've actually, you're right, I've been spending most of my time in the 20-inch wheel one. This one definitely feels even smoother.
Yeah, I like it. It's not as soft as the Ioniq 5, which I also love, but if you're looking for something just a little bit sportier, but not quite Mach E firmness, I think this is a good balance. And the Mach E, it's firm, but it doesn't really say sporty to me, to be honest. Like mine doesn't, because it's that firm, bouncy thing.
Yes.
So it's not it's not like sports car.
Okay, see, I think you need to spend a little more time with the GT Performance.
Well, I love the GT Performance. You had the right one. Your suspension tune is way better because it has the adaptive dampers. And mine needs adaptive dampers really bad. Now let's talk about the numbers. 0 to 60 time in this one with your tester out here was what?
Well, I did 2 runs, and when you average the 2 numbers together, we got about 6.8, which is pretty good. Kia did not mention what their numbers were for this model.
They give us an estimate for the all-wheel drive, though.
Right, but they did. They said 4.6 for the all-wheel drive, and we did test that one as well. But 6.8 is pretty good. I mean, the only thing I noticed with this one, off the line, it just doesn't have the immediacy.
It does feel peppier than the 201 horsepower in the rear-wheel drive ID4, though. It feels more eager, peppier there. Now, unfortunately, I did not bring my tester with me, so we didn't do any 60 to 0 braking testing, but I suspect this is going to be probably around 120 feet if you get the wider tires, the 255s. This one's probably going to be not too far off where we see the base versions of the Mach E, but let's talk curb weight, because this is about 200 pounds lighter than the big battery model of mine, and your GT, I think, is slightly heavier, right?
Yeah, the GT Performance that I have is almost 5,000 pounds, if I remember correctly. And this model that we're driving is about, I think, 200 pounds lighter than the all-wheel drive version. So but this is like 4,500 pounds. It is on the lighter end, and you definitely feel that.
It definitely feels more eager to turn in. I mean, there's still not a lot of steering feel. The steering is just as numb as any electric power steering. So it's hard to tell what the front tires are actually up to. But it does have a really great feel to it. That was the one thing that surprised me. I had expected this to look swoopy, but drive a little bit more like the Ioniq 5, I think.
Yeah, no, that is definitely the biggest surprise. I'm really glad that Kia kind of went with their own identity after the two companies kind of parted ways with the platform. But overall, I mean, from the steering feel to the lack of steering feel, but how quick the steering is, to the suspension tuning, to how quick it feels. Because you mentioned the ID4 rear drive, that feels so slow.
It does, which is odd because it's really, I mean, similar curb weight, similar power. It's not too far off. Just they decided to be much more aggressive with the tuning of this system. Jumping into the all-wheel drive model, this is instantly, obviously faster.
Like we did our testing already. We got 4.5 seconds in this car, which is a half a second faster than the Hyundai Ioniq 5, and about the same number that Kia quotes 4.6, and this thing feels really fast.
And it is definitely peppier than the Mustang Mach E, my Mustang Mach E, even though supposedly it has less power. And obviously that's because this is 200 pounds lighter at least, but also it seems that Kia is allowing you access to all of the oomph sooner.
Yeah, you know, I have to give them a round of applause for just doing this, allowing us to give us like most of the power, giving us this kind of straight line performance and the excellent handling. I mean, I know Kia's coming out with a faster version of this, which has like 240 more horsepower, but this is genuinely fast enough for most enthusiasts, I would think.
And the handling in here is definitely better in the all-wheel drive model because we have those wider 255 tires. Even though there's a little extra curb weight, I think there's enough more tire that this is good compensation.
Yeah, I was mentioning in my video, it is very quiet in here. I mean, even at highway speeds, we were going, 75 earlier, and it doesn't have very much wind noise, very little road noise.
They did a really good job with that.
Yeah, I mean, obviously all you can hear is just that fake noise that this car has, which you can change it between like 4 different types of noise. We both, I think, we like the dynamic mode.
I think the dynamic is the best. Cyber sounds like some sort of animatronic flute that you'd find in Disneyland, I guess.
But that just detail that they put where you can customize the sound, I don't think you can get that in the Ioniq 5.
One interesting touch when it comes to acceleration in the all-wheel drive model is that if it's in eco mode, Kia said it doesn't use the front motor, it just uses the rear motor, and so power drops from 320 down to 225.
Yeah, basically it just becomes the rear drive model when you have
with a little bit extra weight because that motor is still up front.
But it's also cool because when you change the modes, like I did this on the highway, you really feel the driving characteristic change. Like it almost feels like the car is towing something when it's in eco, and then you take it to normal and sport, and it's just like, it just takes
all
off.
that extra power. And it is interesting, Kia says that they're using the same motor in the front and in the rear, but not the same motor control electronics. As a cost-saving measure, obviously. But it also means that this has a very strong rear-wheel drive dynamic. So if you're flooring it, about 100 horsepower up front, 225 in the rear approximately. So it definitely has that rear-happy vibe. And if you're in a corner and you floor it, you will notice that the rear end will always step out a little bit, very much like we see in the Mach E.
Yeah, no, I didn't think there wasn't another electric SUV that did this besides the Mach E, so it's great to see that Kia also
It really is pretty cool.
It's definitely going to appeal more to the enthusiasts, and I think it's just a really well-balanced vehicle.
As far as range and efficiency goes, it looks like you were getting a little bit lower over your day. We were doing tag teaming here most of the day, driving right behind one another. So you were just a little bit lower than me in the rear-wheel drive model, which makes sense. What do you think the range of this would be in the real world? Obviously, we haven't been able to test this.
Right, so when we got into this vehicle, I checked the range, and in eco mode with the climate off, it was showing 292 miles on a full charge, which is 20 more than what Kia says this will do. I don't know if what you saw yours doing, but that one's rated, yours is 310.
Right.
So
yep.
In Kia's independent testing, they said they got 339.
And obviously this will depend on your speeds, etc. But pretty good. I mean, we are 62% battery, and this is what, 170 miles-ish?
Yeah, and this one's been averaging about 2.3 miles per kilowatt. I think you said yours was doing 2.5, so
yep.
that makes sense.
Yeah,
I mean,
pretty close.
But it's honestly, for the extra 100 horsepower, this is not that much less efficient.
And I would say that, those out there that are doing their own math and saying, well, 2.5 does not give you 300 miles of range. We went up and over a 5,000-foot mountain pass, and we were driving on the limited sections of 101 up here that were 70-mile-an-hour speed limit, so we were definitely going faster and clearly, videoing the vehicles, having it parked, etc. So these are actually really good efficiency numbers. And on my way up to the hotel that we're staying at in my Mach E, I was averaging 2.1 miles per kilowatt hour, so definitely a little bit less than these. And this has a heat pump. So like in your climate.
Oh, yes. I would definitely benefit from having the heat pump, so Ford definitely should consider adding it.
Yeah, I've read that's one odd thing with the Mach E, that they haven't considered adding a heat pump. Let's talk pricing. The base EV6 is going to set you back at least $40,900. That gets you the single motor version, 167 horsepower, and just over 230 miles of range. I think the range in that model is pretty acceptable. 167 horsepower seems a little bit slow to me, but it is going to be fairly inexpensive. If you qualify for the full federal tax credit and applicable state and local incentives depending on the area you live in, that model could end up costing you $31,000 to $34,000 approximately. Keep in mind, of course, you have to qualify for that full federal tax credit for it to apply to your car. Next up, we have the $47,000 wind trim. That is going to be the one that gets you 310 miles of range and 225 horsepower. I think that's a reasonably good deal. 225 horsepower is still not as exciting as this model, but 310 miles of range actually is. Now, if you want all-wheel drive, that's not too expensive of a bump. $50,900 for the base all-wheel drive model. That gets you 274 miles of range, but in compensation, 320 horsepower. For me, at least, the Mustang Mach E is the closest direct competitor to the EV6, unless you want to talk about luxury EVs, which honestly, this would compete very well against many luxury EVs. The Mustang Mach E is obviously a style-forward vehicle, but it doesn't have the same sort of sporting mission in mind as the EV6, oddly enough. This is always going to have wider tires, and I prefer the balance in the EV6 to what we find in the Mach E. I actually drove up here to this event in a Mustang Mach E, and I spent time DC fast charging because I had to do that in order to get up here to Healdsburg from Carmel, California, where I was staying overnight. That DC fast charge session also highlighted the fact that this charges much, much faster than the Mach E. I had to spend 45 minutes to get up to 80% battery in my Mach E in order to get here to Healdsburg, and this would have accomplished that task in about half the time, or perhaps a little bit less. This also clings on to high DC fast charge times and rates much, much longer than the Mach E. So if you don't need to stop at 80%, but you need to stop at 90% or 100% of battery, this is going to get you there considerably faster than the Mach E, and it's more efficient as well. So when you're feeding this on your own dime, it's going to cost you less to operate. Now, as I said before, I just so happened to have driven up to this event to drive the EV6 in my Mach E, and this really begs the question, which one would I get? Because these two vehicles are right about the same price, they're right about the same performance level. In fact, the EV6 is a little bit faster than this Mustang right here. The range figure is really close as well. 274 miles in this one, 270 in this one, 277 if you were to get the 2022. But I have to say that if my money were on the line today, I would get the EV6 over the Mach E. And even though I do love the front trunk in the Mach E, and I love the big sheet of glass on the top, I love the fact that this glass opens a little bit more. And I like the performance level and the handling ability that we find in the EV6. And for me, the biggest of them all is the ride quality. The ride quality in the EV6 is, for my tastes, better than what we find in the Mach E. This is that firm and bouncy thing that we see in a number of other big battery EVs, and this drives more like a mid-sized luxury car, I would say. This feels an awful lot like a BMW 5 Series that is about the same sort of weight as this. Be sure and let me know what your pick would be down there in the comment section below, and stay tuned for a video where I take a deeper dive into EV6 versus Mustang Mach E. I'll see all of you later.